Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm going to update my previous performance boost video with the latest data and the recent major update to my swap resizer script. I'm also going to give more information on some questions I've gotten about the fixes and talk a little bit about some things that I normally do to get better performance. Before we start, I have a few disclaimers. 1. This video is intended as a reference for the fixes and how they work. I'll show a few performance numbers, but I suggest you watch my deep dive videos if you want more examples. 2. Some of this footage is going to be from my previous videos as the explanations still hold up, but there will be a lot of new information here too. 3. There is going to be a lot of explanation in here. If you just want the tutorials on how to do the fixes, then please skip to the times on screen now, or use the description to go to any chapters with the word tutorial in them. Lastly, before we get started, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, or ring the bell if you find the content useful. It helps the algorithm show other people these videos and will hopefully propel the whole community forward. First up is my swap fix script, but I'll start out with what performance you can expect from it. Here, we can see that Grand Theft Auto 5 gets a 24% and 14% boost for the low and medium presets. Meanwhile, in Cyberpunk 2077, we got an 11% boost in both low and medium presets. So, there are the results we can get from some hard-to-run games. Let's look at how it works with an explanation taken from my video, Easy Performance Boosts for Steam Deck. To understand what swap is, first, you have to understand a little bit about memory. In a computer, there is short and long-term memory. The long-term memory is stored on hard disk drives, HDDs, or solid-state drives, SSDs. In the deck, we have an SSD varying in size from 64 gigabytes to 512 gigabytes. These are used to store lots of data in the long term, but are slow compared to short-term memory. The types of data stored on this are basically endless. Anything that needs to be stored on a computer for any length of time will be saved to long-term memory. The short-term memory of a computer is stored in various stages of random access memory, or RAM. RAM is super fast, but has low capacity and loses its contents when it doesn't get power, which is why we need long-term memory. The use case for RAM is to have some data on hand so the CPU can access it super quick. Without RAM, everything would need to be fetched from long-term storage every time and the computer would be abysmally slow. Normally, if RAM filled up and you needed more space to store what you're working on, the computer would need to take something out of RAM and then load new data in. This is fine here and there, but in some scenarios, this process can cause issues. One such scenario is gaming. Because we need to have a certain level of maintained performance over a long period of time, any hiccups in this can cause bad frame timing or lower frame rate. So, now that we understand what RAM is, let's go over what a swap file is and why it can help. A swap file, or page file on Windows, is basically an expansion of your short-term memory, stored in long-term memory. This means that it's a lot slower than the RAM, but it provides a buffer for seldom used data that still needs to be at hand. So, let me give you an example to visualize the memory handling on a computer. In this example, let's assume that you're in an office. In this office, there is you and one other person. Let's say that you're trying to tell this person some stats from a game. Your job is to keep track of these stats, including historical data on them. Using this example, we'll have several stages of memory. The first would be what's in your brain right now. You can remember a few stats accurately, but that's about it. Unfortunately, you can't remember all the stats you need to tell the other person. So you decide that you need to hold a piece of paper with some stats on it. The stats on the paper are easily accessible, but you have to look down and read the paper to fetch them. The paper can store more stats than your brain can, but the space on that one paper is very limited, so you decide that you need a filing cabinet. The filing cabinet can store a ton of stats, and it's all sorted really well. But every time you need to find a certain stat, you need to look up where it is, go to the filing cabinet, deposit your old paper, pull out the correct paper, walk back to the other person, and then you have access to it. You decide that it's really annoying to stop, put your paper away, then grab a new page you need from the filing cabinet, so you bring in a table. On this table, you can spread a few dozen papers out before needing to stack them, so you keep things that you know you'll need soon but can't hold on to. The pages are sorted and the data is super easy to access, but you still need to get the right one before you can read the stats to the other person. So, after all of this, we have the following. Your brain in this example is the CPU's cache. It's super fast and always available, but has very limited capacity. The paper in your hand is the RAM. It's pretty fast and it's always available. It has better capacity than your brain, but it's still very limited in space. The filing cabinet is the HDD or SSD. It's super slow but can store tons of data. The table is a swap file. It's close at hand but slower than holding a paper already. It has a decent storage but not nearly as much as a filing cabinet. Hopefully that example helps visualize each stage of computer memory and it'll give you some background on what I'm going to say next. Swap files, unlike RAM, can be resized easily. Once RAM is installed, that's the total you have. With a swap file, you can choose how much of an SSD to provide as swap at any time. By default, the Steam Deck has a 1 GB swap file and 16 GB of RAM. In our previous example, this would be like having an end table instead of a big table to spread papers out on. We can resize the swap or table to be whatever size we need, so that's exactly what my script does. Alright, that was a full explanation of what swap does. Now here's an explanation of swap tendency taken from my Red Dead Redemption 2 deep dive. Swappiness. Hereafter referred to as swap tendency because YouTube hates things that sound like specific body parts. So what is swap tendency? Well, it's how eager the Linux kernel is to put the data into swap rather than RAM on a scale of 0 to 100. The higher the swap tendency, the more often Linux will put data into swap. By default, SteamOS has a swap tendency of 100. That means that most data will go to the swap file rather than staying in RAM, even if RAM is mostly vacant. This is the case both with and without my swap fix and was the way that the OS was designed. Why does it matter? Reducing the frequency of placing data into swap means two things. One, that the main caveat of using swap is heavily mitigated. If we only write to swap when the memory is completely exhausted, it will heavily reduce the wear on your SSD. With a 16 GB swap file and a swap tendency of 1, you'll have less wear than the factory default of a 1 GB swap file with a swap tendency of 100. 2. Any situations where the swap fix could have hurt performance are now basically guaranteed to break even, or maybe even offer a larger boost. Since the deck will use the fastest memory first at all times, there isn't a performance penalty unless memory is really needed. With those explanations out of the way, let's go over something new. Trim. To know why trim exists, you first have to understand a tiny bit about how data gets handled with non-volatile flash memory like SSDs and SD cards. Oh, and before I get into this, I want to put in an advisory. I am a storage nerd. And I know this entire thing is a gross oversimplification of the process. Please do not get mad at me, other storage nerds. I'm not teaching a graduate class. This is simply a tool to help others understand the process well enough that they know why trim is important. With that said, let's get on to the explanation. Essentially, data is written in something called pages to a group called a block, but the drive can only write at the block level, not individual pages. When data gets deleted, the drive can't just delete pages that you don't need anymore, it has to wipe the whole block. The problem is, reading the data in the block, figuring out what it needs to keep, and then writing in the new data would be incredibly slow. So in order to get around that, when the drive writes new data, it just uses a block that's already empty, then marks the old block as not in use. This works super well since now there are far fewer operations it needs to do. The problem comes when all the space that's free on the hard drive is composed of blocks that are marked as not in use and are not actually empty. The whole process goes like this. First, data is loaded into the cache. Second, all the data in the block gets copied to the cache. Third, all the pages on the drive are reinitialized and the data to be written gets formed. Fourth, the blocks are written to the drive in a new location while the old blocks are reinitialized. Note that while this is relatively fast when there are open blocks, the number of open blocks gets smaller and smaller until there's no longer any blocks to choose from, at which point the drive has to start vacating the blocks before writing to them at all. This slows the entire process to a crawl. Enter trim. With trim enabled, there are no concerns about running out of open blocks, at least not until your drive is completely full. This speeds the entire process up significantly. Trim is an operation that a drive can perform that goes through every block, checks if it's marked as not in use, and then writes them all to zeros so they can be used immediately. Every major OS has support for this operation, and most of them do it automatically on a schedule. So, you may be asking, why would I use trim if it's seemingly such a minor thing? As mentioned before, not running trim can cause a major I/O performance hit after extended use of the drive. Games will load slower, installs will be slower, and the OS will feel more sluggish in general. 2. Automatic SSD wear leveling that prevents parts of your SSD from becoming permanently unusable after heavy use cannot work on blocks that aren't ready to be written to. This means that by not using trim, your SSD will wear very unevenly and potentially have a much shorter life. Now that you know a bit about how trim works, I can tell you that it's not enabled on the Steam Deck by default. I'm not sure why, but Valve decided not to use it for some reason, despite it being a standard used in just about every computing application I can think of. The latest version of my script can correct that and enable a weekly trim job. In addition, it allows you to execute a full trim operation on demand, allowing you to regain any lost performance immediately. That said, the newest version of the script is such a massive change that I decided it needed a new name and a new repo to encapsulate it as a bigger and more useful utility. I'm proud to present the new version of the swap resizer, CryoUtilities. It's located at github.com/cryobyte33/steam-deck-utilities and is available right now. The link is in the description below. As a note, the old repo now has a deprecation notice at the top to indicate that it's been superseded. The new utility has the following functionality: a swap file resizer, Swappiness changer, enable or disable trim on schedule, and immediately run trim on all mounted volumes. In addition, it has the following improvements over the swap resizer: a custom icon, an updater script, an improved installer and uninstaller, better debugging information, and an actual README. With that, let's get into a tutorial on how to run it. The only prerequisite is that you set a password in the terminal using the passwd command, now on screen. If you haven't done that yet, then do so now. Go to my repo at github.com/cryobyte33/steam-deck-utilities, as mentioned before. Scroll down to the install heading and the easy subheading, then right-click and save the link. If the link doesn't bring up a dialog box, then try restarting desktop mode or the deck itself. It should work after that. After the file is downloaded, go to your downloads folder and double-click it. A window should pop up asking if you trust the author. Press yes if you trust me, or go read the code in the repo if you'd like to verify it first. After the install is complete, there should be 3 new icons on the desktop: CryoUtilities, an updater, and an uninstaller. If you are upgrading from the swap resizer, you will also see that the swap resizer icons have been removed. Double-click the icon marked CryoUtilities. You'll be asked to enter your password so the script can run system-level commands. Enter your password and you'll be asked if you consent with a disclaimer. Read it and either accept or deny. Next, you'll be asked if you want to resize the swap file. Press yes if you want to resize it. If you've previously used the swap resizer and are happy with the new swap size, feel free to press no. If you choose to resize the swap file, then you will next be asked which size you'd like to use. If you have space for 16 gigabytes, I recommend choosing that. If not, try to get as close to 16 gigabytes as possible, but anything more than the default 1 gigabyte will be beneficial. If you have a ton of storage available, you can try using 32 gigabytes, but I've noticed no performance improvements over 16 gigabytes. After choosing the size, press OK. A progress bar will pop up and let you know where in the process it is. Note that depending on your SSD speed, capacity, and utilization, this has been reported to take up to half an hour. That said, I haven't personally seen it take more than 40 seconds. When the resize is done, you'll be given a few commands to run if you'd like to verify it worked. Just for reference, the commands are ls-lash/home/swapfile and swapon-s, both on screen now. They will both show you the size of the swap file. Press OK to proceed to the next step. The next prompt will ask you if you want to change the swap tendency. If you have a value that isn't 1, I recommend pressing yes. In general, lower is better, with 1 being the best choice, but you may want to experiment with different values, so I left it up to you. If you'd like to revert to the default that ships with SteamOS, choose 100. After you choose a value, press OK and the swap tendency will be set to whatever you chose. Next, you'll be asked if you want to enable or disable trim. Press yes if you're interested in enabling the automatic trim job to run once a week. After you press yes, choose enable to enable the trim job and then press OK. Lastly, you'll be asked if you want to run trim right now. This can take a little while, but there's no harm if it stops partially through, and no danger in it running more often than you need to. For that reason, I recommend pressing yes pretty much always. After pressing yes, a progress bar will pop up telling you that it's running. Depending on how much usage you've put on your drive since the last trim, this can take quite a while. Be patient and it'll eventually complete. Also, just to clarify, this runs trim on both the SSD and MicroSD if one is installed. After the trim completes, press OK and the script will exit. If you want to uninstall the script, just use the icon on the desktop. Note that this will not undo the changes that the script made, so any swap resizes, swap tendency changes, or trim being enabled will persist. If you want to revert those as well, just run the script and set them to default settings before uninstalling the script completely. As for the updater, just double click it and you'll get the latest version of the script each time. This should prevent any further surprises when I update it. That's it for the tutorial. Let's go over some common questions and some that I anticipate getting about the script. What games benefit from the swap fix? Any game that uses a combined 16 GB for RAM and VRAM will likely benefit from the swap fix. How much the swap fix helps will depend on a few factors, including asset compression, asset size, and churn of data in memory. Do the swap changes work for all games? Yup, as a matter of fact, they work for any program on SteamOS loaded from any location. That means that even Google Chrome installed on an external hard drive would benefit from these changes. Will an update revert the swap fix? No, but reformatting the deck will revert it. I tested with several updates and both the swap file and swap tendency settings were left in place. Does the swap file work on Windows? No, but Windows does have an equivalent called a page file, and its size is automatically managed by Windows. I haven't tested performance implications yet, but I believe that it won't bring quite the same amount of performance boost as the NTFS file system is abysmally slow. Are there any situations where the swap fix isn't a good option? Prior to the swap tendency update, extremely memory-heavy CPU-bound processes could take a performance hit from the fix. I haven't found an instance of it in gaming, but I confirmed that Kdenlive and Blender would both cause this to happen, and it worked better without the swap fix. The latest version with the swap tendency tweak does not have this issue, and I've been unable to trigger worse performance in any situation during testing. Does the swap fix hurt emulators? I haven't done any exhaustive testing yet, but no. Many viewers have reported better performance in newer emulators like RPCS3, Yuzu, and CEMU. I hope to do an emulation-focused video soon since I've been emulating for 13 years, but I haven't gotten there yet. Will the swap fix hurt my SSD? Nope. As a matter of fact, setting the swap tendency to 1 will reduce wear on the SSD over the stock configuration. Do differently sized SSDs have a performance difference for swapping? Yes, the read and write speeds both make a difference in the speed of swapping and therefore performance. That said, Valve did a pretty good job at choosing quality parts with relatively similar speeds so that we'd all have a consistent experience. In general, the larger the SSD, the faster it is, but there's a lot more to it than that. That means that upgrading your SSD size could upgrade the performance during swap scenarios, something to keep in mind, but it'll likely be a very small difference. Why didn't Valve have a larger swap file by default? I would guess it's to avoid filling up over half of the 64GB model with operating system, but I'm not sure. Why didn't Valve have a lower swap tendency by default? I have no idea. Is there any reason not to enable the trim job? Not as far as I'm aware. It's an easy win for both storage performance and storage reliability. Is it bad to run trim too often? No, the OS will only run trim on applicable blocks, and it will basically be immediate if you run them back to back. Why didn't Valve enable trim by default? No idea again. They might have a reason, but I think that since the Steam Deck allows us to fix these things for ourselves, we should. Now that we're done with the giant script update, we'll talk about expanding the VRAM. As with the swap fix, here are some charts that can show off the benefits of using this fix. In Cyberpunk 2077, we had lows that were 23% and 12% higher, leading to much smoother gameplay. And in Elden Ring, we can see a performance improvement across the board. Lows are increased by 13% for low and 6% for high. The averages are increased by 5% and 3%. As you can see, changing the VRAM to 4GB can lead to better performance, particularly in the lows. This means the fix usually gives you much smoother gameplay. However, I just want to make sure you are aware of one game in particular that suffers from this fix at the time of filming. Red Dead Redemption 2 has a bug in SteamOS versions 3.3.2 and higher that causes heavy performance losses on VRAM sizes other than 1GB. If you want to know more about this, go watch my Red Dead deep dive. I'm not aware of any other games that the VRAM fix affects negatively, but I wanted to be completely transparent with the current Red Dead situation. Okay, now that we've covered the gains we can get with the VRAM fix, what is it? I'm going to defer to my Cyberpunk 2077 deep dive for this one. Okay, so before we move on to actually doing the VRAM increase, I wanted to explain briefly what VRAM is and how it works with the APU and the Steam Deck. GPUs need their own memory on board to make sure they can store things as quickly as possible. Using regular RAM for a normal PC form factor and a graphics card is way too slow for the high performance we expect nowadays. Basically, an APU is a CPU or processor and a GPU or graphics processor built into the same chip. That's what most consoles, the Steam Deck, and most phones use. In our case, this means that because the APU has to remain small, it has to share memory between the CPU and GPU, which is bad when both the CPU and GPU need as much as they can get. To get around this, there's a limit to how much RAM the GPU can use. In the Steam Deck, the limit is 1GB by default, which isn't enough for larger games and can lead to stutters when swapping data back and forth. Enter our next tweak. By getting into the BIOS of the deck, we can expand it all the way up to 4GB, quadrupling the memory our GPU has to play with. So let's get started. First, we have to completely shut the deck down. That can be done through the power menu, the same way you go to desktop mode, then wait until the screen goes completely black. Next, hold both the power button and the volume up button until you hear a sound come from the deck, then let them go. Wait a few seconds and you should see a weird looking screen with large buttons on it. We need to go to the lower right button, Setup Utility. On this screen, we need to go down one entry to Advanced, then change the UMA frame buffer size from 1G to 4G. Then we can press the Steam Deck Select button and press Yes to save and exit. The Steam Deck will reboot and you should be all done. Alright, with that out of the way, let's go over a few common questions and answers I get about the VRAM tweak. What games will 4GB of VRAM help? Games that can use at least 1GB of VRAM, use at least 8GB of RAM, and use a total of 16GB of both RAM and VRAM could potentially benefit from this. Basically, anytime the CPU might evict data from VRAM is a candidate. Will the 4GB of VRAM work on Windows too? Yes, it works with any software on any OS installed on the deck. Will the VRAM fix get reset when the deck updates? No, normal OS updates shouldn't reset this fix, but a potential firmware update could reset it. Are there any situations where this could cause degraded performance? CPU-only tasks like compiling, CPU encoding, or games that are entirely CPU-bound could be affected negatively by this fix. However, using this in conjunction with the swap fix should remove that issue completely. The only other scenario I'm aware of is Red Dead's bug, as mentioned before. I do really quickly want to shout out all the viewers who have told me games that run better with both of the fixes that I mentioned. Some of the games mentioned are beamng.drive, Kerbal Space Program, Monster Hunter Rise, Apex Legends, The Witcher 3, Sekiro, and emulators. Alright, so now that I went over the fixes, I did want to go over some of the strategies I used to try and improve performance. This will not be an all-inclusive guide to troubleshooting performance, but it might give you an edge trying to figure out why your favorite game is having an issue. These tools are built into the deck itself or into a plugin called Power Tools using the Decky plugin loader. Installing Decky is a bit out of the scope of this video, but I'll show a few settings that I use and when I use them. First is CPU and GPU pinning. Why are they necessary? That requires a bit of background. In order to preserve power and manage heat, CPUs and GPUs almost never run at their full speed for long. They can dynamically switch speed based on how stressed the system is, but the problem is it can take a little bit of time for the chip to ramp up. Pinning basically means putting a pin in the clock speed so that it doesn't fluctuate, and thereby avoids the ramp up period. This helps most when the game's demand on the CPU or GPU fluctuates wildly. Normally, this can happen when turning the camera quickly, a bunch of spontaneous action, or even just some AI trying to figure something out happens. The symptom you'd noticed in game that could tell you that pinning would help is a lag spike when something new starts to happen. As mentioned before, turning the camera quickly is the classic example. GPU pinning can keep the GPU at a sustained speed and can thus prevent a big spike in frame time at the beginning of the camera turning before it can ramp up. GPU pinning is built into the deck under the name Manual GPU Clock Control, and CPU pinning is built into the Power Tools plugin under the name Frequency Limits. Next up, we have what I call core manipulation, which means turning off certain CPU cores. The reasoning behind this also comes back to both power and heat. The deck has 8 logical cores, which means that it has to share all the voltage going into the CPU across those cores. In certain situations, some games need really fast cores rather than a bunch of them. As a matter of fact, that's how almost every game functioned until 2010 or so, and some still do today. By turning off some of the cores, you can raise the amount of power other cores can consume, and that lets them run faster for a long period of time, sometimes even generating less heat in the process. The symptom that would cause you to notice this would be if only 1 or 2 CPU cores were basically maxed out with very little on the others. The setting to change this is built into Power Tools and can be changed by moving the Threads slider. The last setting I'll talk about here, and something that's very similar to core manipulation, is SMT manipulation. SMT, or simultaneous multithreading, is AMD's version of Intel's hyperthreading technology. It essentially allows multiple logical CPU cores to share some components, usually a scheduler and some cache, but also sometimes some specialty resources. This means that you can get twice as many cores to work with, but if both logical threads on the same CPU core are overloaded, then you could have worse performance than if they were on 2 separate cores. This isn't as much of a problem now as it was a few years ago, but in games heavily limited by IPCs, or instructions per clock, it can boost performance by a small margin. The symptom that would cause you to notice this one would be if the game is loading up 2 CPU cores, and core manipulation didn't allow these cores to work any harder. The setting to change this is in Power Tools, and it's a simple toggle called SMT. When disabling it, you'll automatically shut half the cores down, but each of the remaining cores will have dedicated resources that would otherwise be shared. Alright everybody, that's all for this video. Hopefully the refined version of these fixes, the Q&A section, and the detail on some general Steam Deck performance tweaks help you out and can enable you to push your deck and games to the limit. As always, be sure to tell me that you like me with the button below. Ring the bell to awaken the Ancient One from his slumber. Perpetuate my imposter syndrome by subscribing. And comment the words "no comment" to tell me that you would prefer not to comment. As always, thank you to my patrons who made this video possible. Vance Thompson, 808, A0Fail, Frankie Odgers, Chronesis, Lemon, and Brian D. Thank you each so much, you're absolute legends, and your support is making this channel better every day. I would also like to thank my most recent supers, Hawao and Mikael. As always, I'm sorry if I butchered any names. That's all from me. Thank you and have a great day.